Hello, I'm Bonnie Wallace, and I'm with the Wells Fargo Financial Health Philanthropy team. I'm pleased to welcome you to today's webinar hosted by the Financial Health Network, titled Tackling Wage Gaps Through Behavioral Design of Workplace Processes. This webinar is a joint effort between Wells Fargo and Ideas 42, a nonprofit behavioral design firm that focuses on using insights from behavioral science for social good. You'll learn more about Ideas 42 and their work in the course of today's discussion. Before I introduce our speakers, I'd like to cover a few logistics. First, we'd really like to make this webinar conversational. This is informal, and we welcome and encourage your questions and comments. So please use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen to submit your questions anytime during the webinar. Next, attendees will be in listen-only mode. So if you'd like to access closed captioning, please select closed caption at the bottom of your screen. And our last little bit of housekeeping, while we want to foster an open dialogue and create an atmosphere of trust, we also want to be aware of what may appear to be antitrust conflicts. So the Financial Health Network abides by the spirit and the letter of antitrust laws. So in attendance today, while I can't see everybody's titles, I'm going to assume that we've got practitioners, strategists, administrators, program managers, and analysts, all focused day after day, many of us all day, day after day, on financial health. Despite enormous efforts and equally enormous investment to move the needle in financial health, we've seen only marginal improvements in aggregate, requiring us to constantly seek and create new programs and approaches in hopes that we'll find better ways to drive significant gains. Often, and perhaps very often, our focus is external as we look to make these changes. We look to change our outreach, our engagement strategies, our products and services, without considering how the inputs to all of this effort really works, specifically the human inputs, the inputs that impact the effectiveness of what we create and what we deliver. And as we work on our project plans and our metrics and our dashboards, we need to ask ourselves if what we're delivering is really steeped in the self-identified needs of the communities that we're trying to help. We need to determine if there's a seat at our table for people who have the lived experiences necessary to drive meaningful and impactful outcomes. Our discussion today will focus on using behavioral science to provide a new approach for getting the right people in place to drive improvements to financial health challenges. I'm going to introduce now our co-presenters. The first is Katie Davis. Katie is the Managing Director at Ideas 42, where she oversees US-based work in financial health and related areas. She'll be sharing a bit of background on why the wage gap topic is important and where a behavioral science perspective adds value. Next, we'll have Victoria Lucas. And Victoria is the Director of People Operations at Ideas 42, where she drives recruiting, performance management, internship, and training work. Victoria will be part of our panel discussion. And last is Harrison Newart. He's a Senior Associate at Ideas 42, where he works on applying behavioral insights to projects in financial health and post-secondary education. He's recently focused on recruiting a diverse set of entrepreneurs for our shared ventured studio. I'm going to pass it over to Katie, who's going to share some background on the wage gap and get us started. Katie?
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Bonnie. So there is a lot going on in the world right now. So we really wanted to ground our discussion around this persistent problem we see in financial health known as the wage gap. So the wage gap very simply refers to the difference in median income earned by groups of people with different identities. And really, since the 1950s, there's been a growing awareness around the gender wage gap, and the disproportionate impact of the wage gap for women of color in particular. The wage gap actually widened from 2010 to 2018, And the latest figures show us that for every dollar earned by a white man, we see around 79 cents earned by white women, 62 cents earned by Black women, and only 54 cents earned by Latinx or Hispanic women. And I think here it's important to note that this is not the only factor affecting these groups when it comes to financial health. Take something like student debt, where women represent around 57% of all undergraduates, yet they hold 67% of all outstanding student debt. Black women in particular hold a disproportionate share of student debt. So these are forces that really end up compounding. And when you consider, some of you may have seen the really staggering job losses since the pandemic started and how they've been disproportionately borne by women, and especially women of color. It's a pretty bleak picture when it comes to how lower wages, higher debt, and job insecurity can add up over the course of someone's lifetime, and really add to that wealth gap that we ultimately see for women and women of color. If we could move to the next slide. Thanks so much. Now, switching to a slightly different realm of tech entrepreneurship, we actually see strikingly similar disparities in terms of where venture capital flows. So one study of startups based in the US that receive venture capital funding showed that among all of those startup founders, just a little over 9% identified as women. Less than 3% of those founders were Black or Latinx Hispanic. And we even see disparities around educational background, where more than a quarter of that total pool of invested capital actually goes to founders who specifically attended college at an Ivy League school. So these types of disparities contribute to those wealth gaps that we see. And they also have an impact on us as consumers and society in terms of what products actually make it into market and who are those products and services created for and designed for, and whose needs do they meet. So switching back to the workplace, the most typical solution that's been attempted to fix these problems is diversity training. These types of trainings often focus on changing individuals' attitudes, perceptions, beliefs in order to root out or correct bias. And they've been implemented pretty widely. About half of mid-sized US companies have some form of diversity training. And yet we don't see a lot of impact on solving the problem. There isn't a ton of experimental evidence around the actual impact of these programs. The evidence that is out there suggests that for one-time trainings, they may shift attitudes and perceptions, but it often dissipates just a few days after the training. And other trainings suggest that certain forms or delivery of these trainings could actually have a backlash effect. One study found that when diversity trainings are framed as compulsory or mandatory, some participants actually reported greater animosity towards other groups after leaving that training. So there needs to be a lot of investigation around what's the right delivery, framing, and frequency of these types of trainings, and what other types of solutions might be in our toolkit to complement them. So where does behavioral science fit in? This is what we'll be talking about today, in terms of where can we expand that solution set with new insights. One of the central tenets of behavioral science is that as humans, our behavior is disproportionately impacted by the environment around us. And when I say environment, I mean not just physical environment, but also our social networks, the social norms that we see, the sorts of cues and signals that we get from our coworkers in the workplace, as well as the formal systems and policies that we encounter. So behavioral science focuses on changing that context in order to shift behaviors and outcomes. And this is where we can really ask, are there opportunities here within our processes and systems and our informal practices to promote equity in everything from hiring and recruiting to performance evaluation and promotions, back to the venture capital world in terms of interview practices and how pipelines are composed for entrepreneurship. So today I'm very excited for two of my colleagues, Victoria and Harrison, to zoom in on two contexts that they've been working in. So Tori will tell us a bit about the practices we've implemented internally at Ideas 42, and Harrison will share some behavioral insights that have really shaped our recruiting strategy for entrepreneurs within that Ventures for Shared Prosperity initiative. And with that, I will kick it back to Bonnie to get our discussion started.
Thank you, Katie. I do want to thank Ideas 42 because in the last year that we've been working together, they really have been doing a great job of stretching my thinking. So a lot of the concepts that you'll hear today probably will seem pretty intuitive, but at the same time, they're kind of radically different than the way we've been approaching things in the past. So I'm excited to share these with you. So first, Victoria, your title is Director of People Operations. So I'd like you to talk a little bit about that. It's not something that we typically hear in financial services. So if you can explain a little bit about that, and then, tell us what's kind of drawn you to this work.
Sure. Thank you, Bonnie, and welcome to everybody today. People operations is what we at Ideas 42 like to think about as a forward-thinking way of thinking about your traditional human resources function or your traditional human resources arm. And so in my purview, I have everything from recruitment to performance management, thinking about how we can have a diverse pipeline of folks coming into the organization, how we can create equity, as I also oversee diversity, equity, and inclusion at the organization. So all of those things come together, including our culture and engagement arm under people operations. And traditionally, people think of diversity, equity, and inclusion and behavioral science solely from the recruiting perspective. Most often, people think about it in the context of interviews. So I'm sure many of you, regardless of what it is that you do, may have heard of behavioral interviewing. And that's one piece of the puzzle in terms of how it is that we can think about behavioral science and diversity and equity and inclusion. But generally, behavioral science is really just thinking about human behavior. How is it that we can remove barriers that prevent our intended positive outcomes? I'm sure we all want to be more diverse, equitable, and inclusive in our organizations, but how is it that we can actually implement processes and plans in place to make that happen throughout a team member's entire experience with an organization? So I have the joy of doing that. I make sure we take that lens to all of the different functions that fall under people operations that I've already mentioned. Some of it might be a compliance issue, for example. So when thinking about when bringing a team member on board, you want to make sure you're not doing anything illegal. So there are those pieces, but also how is it that we can formalize it from a human-centered way and thinking about if it's illegal for me to ask someone, so I'll use Bonnie, if it's illegal for me to say, Bonnie, how much did you make in your last job? That's one thing, but thinking about how I can come up with a compensation structure that pays Bonnie for the work that she will be doing in this role, regardless of what she's made, because of some law, is really what we're trying to get at. So really bringing the behavioral science throughout our practice is what we try to do.
Thank you, Victoria. And then Harrison, tell us what's brought you to this work.
Yeah, thanks, Bonnie, and thanks, Victoria, and everyone. It's really exciting to be on this webinar today. So I come to this work from a slightly different place as someone who's really gotten to be a practitioner over the past 6 months or so. So over at Ideas 42, we're working on a really exciting project called Ventures for Shared Prosperity, where we're trying to bring in some entrepreneurs to co-create software businesses with us that can help address some of the excess costs of poverty. And so to just say a few more words about that, we know that living in a context of poverty in the US is far too expensive. There are so many costs that, that people bear disproportionately. And we don't think that software businesses are the entire solution to that, but we think that there are some gaps in the market that good software businesses that are behaviorally informed can help fill. And so it's been my privilege to help lead the team that's recruiting people who are going to come help build those businesses with us as entrepreneurs. And Katie shared some of the statistics around where we know venture capital goes and who we know as a founder in the US. And we're conscious that we're doing this recruitment in an environment where there are massive disparities and people who have really been shut out of the kind of entrepreneurship that we want to do. And in fact, many of those people are exactly who we're trying to recruit, because we want to recruit people who have real lived experience of the kind of topic areas that we're hoping to address. We think it will help them be better leaders with more insight and into the nuance of these problems, and also sort of sustain that passion for entrepreneurship over years and over many of the bumps along the way. So that's like the big picture of what we're trying to do. And so we're really conscious that DEI needs to be at the core of the recruiting process that we're finishing up right now. And that in order to recruit the kinds of entrepreneurs with lived experience, we need to look at every step of our pipeline and process and make sure that we're being as equitable and as inclusive as possible. And a behavioral lens that we all have as people working at Ideas 42 has been really helpful in doing that, and has led us to some practices from research and then just from our own experience and practice that I think have been really helpful over the past 6 months of this recruitment. So I'm excited to talk more about that and to answer questions. And just before we kick over to other questions, I do want to say I'm not the only person working on this. So Victoria has been an amazing resource in the Ideas 42 People Operations team. I also want to shout out my colleague Blessing Oganyemi, who's been an amazing co-conspirator on this project, and folks like Manasi Desai and Katie. There's been a huge team. So I'm excited to be talking with you all today, but I wanted to make sure I had a chance to shout out to the other people who thought really hard about this.
Thank you, Harrison. And, you know, you mentioned shared prosperity catalyst, and this is something that we've shared with the Financial Health Network members previously, but it's probably worth kind of just quickly revisiting what the shared prosperity catalyst is. And if you can also, as you explain what this initiative is about, kind of explain why it's different and why some of the innovation that we've kind of pursued in the past hasn't been quite as impactful as we've wanted it to be, and how Shared Prosperity Catalyst addresses some of those shortcomings.
Yeah, for sure. So the Shared Prosperity Catalyst is a multi-year and multi-pronged engagement that we have generously funded by the Wells Fargo Foundation. And it really has three components. So there's a policy lab that we're starting to look at some of the policy drivers of that can be drivers of shared prosperity. There's a bucket of work around narrative change, where we're really looking at narratives around prosperity, inequality, and poverty that exists in the US and trying to change those. And then there's this venture side, where we are looking at the role of social entrepreneurship in trying to create shared prosperity. So it's a multi-pronged approach. And the one that I can speak best to is the ventures, because that's the work that I'm doing. I think where we see the biggest difference in terms of the way that we've worked at in the past at Ideas 42, and also sort of the general landscape, is definitely around this role of lived experience. So we have all sorts of ideas for great potentially socially impactful and behaviorally informed businesses that we can start, that we think can do a lot of good in the world. But we also know that we need different people on our team to start those. And that we know that the people who will be best at doing it are really the people who have that specific lived experience of these topic areas. And so that's it's not entirely a reframe from our project work. We really appreciate the role of lived experience in that too, but having it so central to just the very recruiting aspect of this work has been something that has been a change, a different focus for me and for the team, at least.
I'm excited to have you share in the course of this conversation the deliberate actions that you're taking to make sure that you're able to accomplish that. So thank you so much, Harrison. The first thing, Victoria, I'm going to direct this really to you. What are some areas of behavioral science that you found relevant or helpful in identifying barriers to equitable practices?
Sure. Um, there are several. I'll try and stay succinct. I'll start with thinking about equity in how you share and make people aware of benefits and even how you design benefits. So benefits within an organization is a huge part for a lot of people. Um, People who need to be able to bring their healthiest, best selves to work on a day-to-day basis really need to be able to have access to healthcare. And so some of the behavioral things that we have instituted within our organization have included the employer actually paying the coverage, paying the premium for team members. So there isn't the hassle of a team member having to choose a quote unquote lower cost healthcare because there's something around finances that might be prohibitive for them. Another thing from a behavioral perspective is the way that we have shared benefits information with team members. I have a story that I actually would like to share with you, Bonnie, about this one. I had a team member who was previously an intern with us and had done really great work. We knew we wanted to hire them, and we hired them full time. And once they got accepted into our benefits package, etc., they came to me and said, you know, this is the first time that I have a job of my own. This is the first time that I'm being given benefits that I have to sit through and select. And sounds like great information, but it's not accessible, it's not understandable, and it feels like jargon. And immediately I was like, oh, we have to change this, because I had a really great relationship with that person, and they had the comfort to come to me. And I couldn't think if there were other team members who had secretly never shared, that they too were confused about how we even shared our benefits information and the way that we presented things. And so being thoughtful around not just taking the packages that we're getting from our insurance companies and laying them at our team members' feet, but how is it that we can take the key snippets of information, put it together on some really clear and succinct slides, so it's in a way that they can understand of how do I enroll, how do I do this, where do I go for those pieces of information. That's what makes your benefits equitable, because it's actually accessible. Being able to think around leave time, regardless of birth, foster, or adoption, might be just, you know, technical FMLA, but how do we ensure that we're doing that for both parents, regardless of gender and gender identity? How is it that we're making sure that parents are aware of the leave time, that it's sufficient for them to be able to care for their children? So those are some of the things from a benefits perspective. When thinking about promotions, I like to think about promotions as well. You can do some great work, and I can hire 2 people that do great work. But if I'm not asking the same questions and giving the same opportunities to all of my team members and tracking that through intentionally prompting our managers to think about it when they're having their one-to-one conversations, by giving them the tools, give the managers an agenda, give managers the questions to ask their performance reviews, make sure all managers are using the same tools. It allows for not just equal access upon hiring, but it allows for equal opportunities while the team member is there, so that they're promoted, so that they're being recognized for the work that they're doing. If you don't give everyone the same opportunity, then you're going to end up having disparity in promotion rates. And we statistically check that at Ideas 42.
Well, I love your story, Victoria, of the benefit story. And so a question for you, though, is, you know, how do we get out of our own heads in our own ways, right? Because if we from where we sit, we understand how the benefits work. It's hard to imagine that someone can't. So what did you take from that experience? And are there, you know, certain ways that you can kind of test your own assumptions or thinking?
Absolutely. The best way to get out of your own way, and I think this is particularly relevant for, regardless of the type of work that you do, you don't want to approach it from the messenger's lens, right? I had a professor in grad school that used to say, help is only helpful if the receiver deems it so. And so if I think that I'm helping you, if I think I'm giving you information, it might be helpful in my mind, but if the person who's receiving it doesn't find it to be helpful, then it's not actually helpful. So making sure you're talking to the people, the affected communities, the affected intended recipients about, is this going to work for you if I share this in this way? Having those conversations, getting that feedback loop, that's really the basic step in getting out of your own way. And then you can use the behavioral principles on top of that.
Thank you. And then Harrison, what would you have to add?
Yeah, so we've thought about a lot of different facets of behavioral science that play into our recruitment process. And I think the one that I want to talk about is actually sort of a slightly more nebulous behavioral concept, which is we've thought a lot about our mental models of who an entrepreneur is and the mental models that might exist in general. And so a mental model is actually not the best sort of defined area of psychology, but in general, it's this idea that we sort of use schemas of information where we have sort of a loosely associated set of criteria that help us determine if something looks like it belongs to a category or not. And very early on in this process, we realized that many of the people on our team internally had, a variety of different mental models about who a good entrepreneur would be. And we were concerned that if we didn't start to clarify those and actually put them down in writing in some specific language, that we're potentially going to disregard applications from people who would be really great. And that we were also going to potentially message to people in a way that didn't make them feel included if they didn't have a background that is entrepreneurship with a capital E. And so like one concrete area I can point to is we spent a lot of time writing the introductory materials on our application website to really get beyond this who is an entrepreneur and write a lot of examples of here's the sorts of things that we think are central to entrepreneurship. You need to be able to get other people excited about an idea and be persuasive. You need to be able to think about a problem that's really important in the world and think about what would be driving it, and try to help people who maybe haven't done traditional entrepreneurship see aspects of themselves or their skills in that. And then on our side as a team, we set out to define some really specific criteria that we wanted to see. And so we had lots of conversations with experts around what they think makes for good entrepreneurship. We reviewed a lot of different literature. In this case, the literature around what good entrepreneurship or what traits predict entrepreneurship is not extremely robust. But we did review all of that, and we sort of created our own rubric and language. And so that way, when someone on our team, if Victoria says, wow, I had an interview with Bonnie and she's great. I think she would be really good at this, which is the sort of thing that we all tend to say in a hiring process. We can say, okay, which of these 9 criteria that we have is she great at? And we can actually get more specific than like this person seems right towards this person demonstrated these attributes in a way that we think will make them really good in our program. And we're constantly challenging each other to take our general mental model impressions of people and put them in specific and concrete language, which I think is a really behaviorally backed approach to trying to get out of this sort of like murky idea of who might be good at the job.
I love this idea of mental models and challenging your mental models. So this is kind of a loaded question, right? I'm sure I know the answer here is, how do you create a workforce within Ideas 42, as an example, where you don't all have the same mental model, so you can challenge one another? Maybe that's a question for Victoria.
Well, Harrison might be able to add the whipped cream and the cherry. I'll start with the ice cream. It starts with having the conversation with people of different levels. One of the things that I try to do as head of people operations is make sure that I am including others in the process. And an example of that is we recently refreshed our promotions materials. We switched systems. We switched from one system to a completely different one. We refreshed our competencies. And I am smart, I am capable, but I am not an associate at Ideas 42. And so for me to think that I and I alone am the expert of their role and can therefore write down every competency as it makes sense to evaluate their work it wouldn't work. It wouldn't fly. And so to make sure that even if you're starting with a small group, nobody wants 15 chefs in a kitchen, some like oregano, some like parsley, but you have to have some people in the room. And you have to have people who are having the conversations, who manage associates, even bringing in a couple of associates into the room to be able to make sure that the work that you're doing is actually going to make sense. It doesn't have to be a large party every time, because that's where it can get contentious. But build the trust with people, let them know that you're doing this with their input because you know it's going to impact them. And starting from that level is really what it's about, having that trust, that psychological safety of, I'm not doing this for me. It doesn't affect me. I want to make sure I get this right because I'm doing this for you.
You're making me hungry with all the references. Harrison, do you have any whipped cream for that, or a cherry?
Yeah, sure. I mean, to sort of talk to the Ideas 42 context, I'll say, as someone who's not on the people operations team, one thing that I've really appreciated is the way that Victoria's team does one-on-one conversations, which is very much part of our behavioral design approach, where we have an interview guide and we're doing qualitative research to try to understand the barriers people face. And I've sometimes gotten to be that one in the one-on-one and been asked some really specific questions about my experiences. And I think both being able to share some of my experiences and knowing that other team members are being consulted in that way, I think is so crucial. So just sort of getting beyond we heard this through the rumor network and towards that proactive approach, I think is a really good one. And then on the ventures side, I think it's recognizing that there are many good ways to be an entrepreneur. There's sort of no one perfect candidate. And so trying to talk about the unique strengths of our applicants and think about them as trying to look for diversity within the cohort we're hiring. And it's really great that we're able to hire a cohort. So we don't sort of have to just have one prototype we're shooting towards. We can have people who are good at different skills and can kind of think about how different folks would be good at different aspects of the job, which I think is really crucial.
Yeah, and and observing Ideas 42 go through this process of recruiting for the venture studio, it has the aha moment for me was really understanding that the processes and practices you're using to recruit for the venture studio to ensure that you get the right people that have the lived experiences to be able to deliver impactful solutions, those same processes and practices are what you have to do within Ideas 42 in your people operations to make sure that you've got that diverse group who can challenge one another and challenge each other's mental models so you can be effective on delivering your job. So that's why I started in the beginning saying, it seems pretty common sense when you say it, but it's not necessarily how we've been working, in the past. So this has been super helpful to me. And I want to take another step further, Harrison. So are there any specific tools or solutions based on evidence that you've incorporated into your processes to help them become more equitable?
Yeah, there's definitely a lot of practices from academic literature that we've thought about and incorporated where we can. There's also, as a practitioner, I think there's a lot of practices that we have understood from other people's processes, and we've had to sort of tweak a little bit to fit ours. So maybe a good example of that one would be blinding. So there's actually a long and behavioral literature around the ways that blinding within hiring processes can lead to more equitable results. Going back to some experiments run with blinding in orchestra hiring and sort of continuing beyond that. And so we have been really inspired by that work. We've also read some critique around the ways that if you're really deliberately trying to build in different facets of diversity, there are times when you actually want to know who you're interviewing and want to understand their experience specifically in a way that's maybe hard to do if you've blinded. So we've been really intentional with where we've used blinding as a tool in our process. An example of where we've done that is, we had a case study as part of the process and we had multiple reviewers for the case study. And then we all came back together to discuss the scores. And at that point of discussing how people scored on the case study, we blinded names. So we start by just looking at, here's a person, here's their overall scores in the comments. where has this person demonstrated strength? Where have they had challenges? And then we unblinded to take a deeper look. Is there anything we're missing just by looking at their scores? And I think that was a really good approach for us that allowed us to sort of have the best of both worlds, where we realized we couldn't do a fully blinded approach, partially because of software limitations and partially because of our own concerns about missing stuff, but we could use it at that crucial moment of that first discussion of how did this person do? And I feel really good about that part of the process.
Thank you. Victoria, we're using the term behavioral science, right? A lot of what we're talking about has some, soft skills involved, some feelings, but then we're also, the term science is right in there. So data is a big part, I know, of what you do. So how do you and your teams use data to check, guide, or iterate on your process designs? Where does data come in?
Data is key for us. We have a talent dashboard of which a light touch version is actually transparent internally to team members. It almost runs as a secondary accountability metric, so that all of the team is aware of what we look like as an organization, our progress, etc. We run statistical checks on the outcomes of our promotions. We run them against race, we run them against gender. We're trying to monitor if groups are disproportionately affected. Thankfully, we haven't found that in our work so far, but it's something that we do on an annualized basis. We want to be intentional around how is it that we can take data that we collect from our organizational evaluation survey. So many organizations will have, an annual survey. We take metrics from there and we look at the key things that we've said as a people operations function we want to make progress on. And we do report backs. If there's something that needs to be immediately addressed, we'll create a particular task force around ensuring that we do it. So it's not just about measuring the result. It's nice to know, okay, an organization is 50-50 in their gender split. But for us, it's about, okay, but where are those who identify as women? Are they all at the entry level roles? What does our leadership look like? And then what are the intentional practices that we can use? For us, that was particularly salient because we had a goal of taking 2 years to get our leadership to gender parity, which we were able to accomplish. So we wouldn't have been able to do that if we didn't look at the data and then set up key things and processes in place to make sure we would be able to work to get ourselves there.
Thank you. And I want to just address the audience for a minute. Please start putting your questions into the Q&A box. We're going to try and wrap this up in about 5 minutes and leave plenty of time for questions. So please start putting those in. And Harrison, you had mentioned to me work that you do that's called a slate review when you're recruiting. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. And this concept came from, I'm blanking on the name of the professor, but this is not something we invented, but this is sort of a concept that's been put forth as a good way to have an equity check within a process using data, and it's something that we've adopted. So rather than having candidates submit applications at all different times and then sending out case studies on different weeks and then moving people through the funnel sort of ad hoc, we've really prioritized moving people through each phase of our process all together in what we call a slate. And so we're making all of our decisions about who will move to the next round and who won't at one time. And then before we actually send those notifications, we do a quick check to see, have we disproportionately rejected people of a certain race or gender or level of ability or another facet of diversity that we've captured in our data? And again, we have not seen that over the course of our project, but it's been important to us to have that check before we send the emails or before we send emails to half of the candidates, so that we, if we do need to adjust something or go back and look at what happened, we can actually do that, and we can maybe push the timeline out a couple of days, or we're ready to spend time reviewing based on the data we have. So I think it's not just collecting the right data over a process, but it's actually reviewing it at a time when you can impact that process and setting up your timeline so that you have the buffer to do that. And I think a lot of recruiting processes don't always have that because they're not prioritizing the slate review. And I think it's really something that's worthwhile if you can do it.
Right. Instead of waiting until the end and realizing you don't have the right, pool to choose from at the end.
Yeah.
Well, there's another term. There's lots of terms and phrases that Ideas 42 uses that are new to me. One of them is procedural justice. It's actually kind of a term that's kind of pretty timely within the last week of events in our country, but I know that you don't use it the same way. So what does procedural justice mean and how do you use it?
Sure. Procedural justice is ensuring that those folks who are affected by a particular decision knows what goes into actually making that decision. And so a lot of procedural justice is really about transparency. A really good example that I can share about that is how we do promotions at Ideas 42. So we actually do them on a biannual basis, so twice a year. And what we do at the top of the year is we share the calendar so everyone knows the calendar so they can be prepared from a behavioral lens of, I know that, the first week of March, I'm going to be talking about my development. So it's ensuring that people know what is happening when, being transparent about that. The second piece that makes procedural justice work is that we're transparent about what happens during the processes. So we actually, as an organization, share blank templates of the materials that we use during performance management conversations as leadership team. So this team knows what questions are asked, clarifying, what are these rating questions that we have, and what does that mean? Making sure everyone not only has the materials, but they have them in time and in moment. Sending something once and saying, but I shared it to you, a year ago is not helpful. Sharing things timely, making sure that people are understanding what the questions are and being able to have those conversations with their manager, knowing what the timeline for when a promotion will be decided, when you're going to connect with your manager. All of those things are important and they feed into procedural justice. By implementing that, we actually, when we did our pulse survey at the end of our refresh at the spring of 2020 from our performance management system, our transparency scores went through the roof. It was a huge sigh of relief because we then realized that our team members finally understood what was being asked of them, what they're going through when we're talking about performance management and talent management. And the thing that makes it important is that the literature shows that even if you do not necessarily get the outcome that you've hoped for, having the trust in the process is more important. And so that's what procedural justice is really all about in some ways that we institute that at Ideas 42. It sounds scary for some people. They're like, oh no, please don't make me. But it works. I genuinely encourage folks to think about it because it works.
Then Harrison, I know that you apply a similar approach in your recruiting in terms of transparency and also just in terms of making someone feel really good about the process and feel appreciated. So can you speak to that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think we've really drawn on what Victoria is talking about and have drawn more broadly on the sort of literature around operational transparency that Mike Norton and colleagues have worked on. So the idea, very similar to what Victoria is saying, not just that transparency leads to good outcomes, but that people feel more bought into processes. They have a better affect towards sort of the government or other entity that is doing processes if they feel like they understand what's happening. And so we've tried to make sure that that's happening everywhere we can. We've been as transparent with people about things like timelines and next steps as possible. And we've also really thought about it as an equity concern. So one thing that's come up for us is, we want to be transparent, but we've thought a lot about the difference between transparency and openness, or like sort of pushing versus pulling transparency. So I think it's one thing to say, if somebody asks me for whether they can have an extension, then I'll give it to them. Or if someone asks me what we're looking for in this phase, then I'll tell them. And it's another to tell everybody that proactively. And we're really trying to do that second thing. So as an example, we thought at the start of this process about who's going to ask us for informational interviews. And is there bias or disproportionate effects of those with who's in our network, who feels comfortable reaching out? We think pretty clearly, yes. We were concerned about the possibility for some people to, call me up, and I would love to talk to, I like to talk to people, so I'm sort of happy to tell anyone anything I can. But we don't want to do that because we want to make sure that people have the same level of access. So instead, we hosted some open webinars where we just talked about the sort of things you would talk about in an informational interview. Why are we doing this? Who's on the team? What are we excited about? Do we have any hints for people as they go through the process? But we put those publicly on our webpage, and we made sure that everyone who was interested was invited, and everyone who didn't have a chance to go could go see them later. So we're not just being transparent when people ask us for information. We're really trying to get all of that stuff out in the open so that people who might not benefit from it, or might just even not know how to ask or feel uncomfortable asking us, have it as a default.
Thank you. Now, Katie, we've got a couple questions that have come in. You want to take the lead on those?
Sure. Yeah, we actually have a lot of good questions, so we'll need to prioritize a little bit here. The first one is for Victoria. And the question is, I'm curious to learn more about the research into the disparity in promotion rates. How did you measure it? And what were the most effective ways you've found to make promotion paths more equitable?
Sure. So there's a lot. You can go the free route with research if you don't necessarily have access. They do not pay me, but I would recommend something along the lines of an HBR. You get your first 2 or 3 free within the month. And there's a lot of research out there that talks about how self-reflections play into promotions processes, who feels more comfortable speaking about their accomplishments, how that can disproportionately affect those who have different personality types. Gender, it tends to be particularly strong in terms of the gender affinity. And so what we at Ideas 42 thought about was, how is it that we can recognize that team members want to have a say in their promotion process to a particular degree, but how can we ensure that it's equitable? So what we did was we took, particularly for promotions, a 3-step approach. And what we did was we took a list of the key 6 questions, and we had everyone answer it. So the manager is answering the same set of questions that the managee would answer, which are the same set of questions that the peer feedback were. And so what it is, it's more of a total view, asking the same questions so that you're getting different perspectives on the competencies, on the performance of the team member, as opposed to me just saying to Katie, what do you think about Bonnie's moderation skills? Where I go to Harrison and say, what do you think about Bonnie's analysis skills or her verbal communication? So what are the things that we need to know? How can we aggregate them? And how can we ensure we were asking everyone the same questions so that people didn't only ask light touch or harder questions depending on who the person was? That was one of the key changes that we instituted that we found to be most profound at Ideas 42.
That's super interesting, and it mirrors findings in VC interview practices as well, where women and people of color get asked different questions in the interviews. Next question, I think, can go to both of you. Maybe we'll start with Harrison and then move to Victoria. The question is, when I think about using behavioral design to improve wage gaps, I think about the leadership buy-in that is needed. I wonder if there are applications for creating mind shifts in leadership to build that buy-in. For example, examining net disposable income for entry-level workers, as PayPal has done, or taking a more holistic approach to the benefit offerings. Do you have any comments on that?
I don't have a ton of specific comments aside from saying, yes, I think organizational change is a route forward for behavioral science and is something that I know a lot of people in the field are thinking about a ton. I feel, as someone who's sort of been given a lot of ability to shape this process from a project manager perspective, but not a senior leadership perspective, that simultaneously I want to say that leadership matters because it does. And I think one reason why we've been able to do so much is because we have tremendous leadership on the Venture Studio and at Ideas 42 that is really prioritizing equity, not just as something that's good for our programs, but something that is right and just and important. So I think that matters, but I think the other thing that I would just want to say is, a lot of this is stuff that you can do if you're project managing or the hiring manager or running the process. It's not sort of all just the big picture tweaks. I think individuals can also do things like think about, what am I really hiring for? Am I asking everyone the same question? And while it's really good to have leadership to make sure that's instituted consistently, I want to make sure people on the call feel sort of empowered to do some of this as they're able to within their purviews also, if you're not in that leadership role. So I think yes to org change, and also yes to be in your own org change sometimes.
I guess a couple of quick adds as a person who sits in leadership is that leadership just needs to be reminded of how it benefits the organization. At the end of the day, we know that having women in the workplace is important. It matters. We've seen the studies. You don't even need a JSTOR article for that. You can take a CNN or a Fox Business article and put that down and be able to get that information. From a leadership perspective, for me, it was particularly important. And if there's anyone who is an HR practitioner on the call, I might shake you up with a little bit with this one, but I should not pay a person who graduates from an HBCU in 2020 anything different than I pay a person who graduates from a private white institution, anything different than I pay someone who graduates from a state college. That's what equal pay for equal work really means. And so being able to not range out, I know I shook a couple of people, I'm sure, but instead of creating these crazy ranges, equal pay for equal work genuinely means, regardless of who I have coming into this role, this is the number that I'm going to pay them. And to be able to set that up from a scale perspective internally, making sure that I have the research to make sure that we're competitive still. It doesn't mean you can't be competitive, to still make sure that we're competitive, but thinking about compensation from that lens. Again, I already shared the benefit story, but thinking about our benefits from that lens, can we automatically enroll people in 401ks and then have them opt out instead, right? Like, those are the little things that make such a big difference in the lives of folks and help them to close the wage gap generally.
Before we move on to the next question, if I can say one other thing sort of about, I think the broader question about like scale and what level do you need to do this at? I think one other thing to think about is not just the leadership and the individuals in the process, but the tools you're using in the process. And I'll say one thing that we've had to think a lot about is the specific hiring tool we're using. And I'm not going to say good or bad things about any particular vendor, but I'll say on our side, in order to do some of this detailed criteria review that moves away from mental models, we've had to download all the backend data and like make our own interface to look at occasionally. So I think that's another area where if you're trying to think about what levers you have to do some of this work at scale beyond just leadership, think about the tools you use is important too.
Do you have time for one more question, Bonnie?
One more quick one.
Great. So this question is probably most directed towards Victoria, but Harrison might also have thoughts. A lot of the ideas that were shared are great examples of a transparent work culture. What is a good first step for an organization to take towards getting to where your company is today?
Look yourselves in the mirror and say, what are the things that are making me crazy, and how can I really take the things and help? So at Ideas 42, we have a methodology, and I won't get into the semantics of it due to time. But really what we do is we take a look at the problem, right? And so I'll use everyone's favorite example of performance management again, because while we have gotten better, it's never going to be an A+ regardless of the organization. Somebody will always go, I think it could be a little bit better. And so let's take the example of performance management. What is the one gripe that your team members are consistently having with performance management. Now let's back yourselves out of the problem. Is it that team members aren't being promoted fairly? Is it that you're seeing a disparity in who's being promoted? Is it that you're having an opportunity issue? So taking a look at the problem, backing yourself out. So one, you can define the problem. Two, do some diagnosis on it. Interview your team members, look at the data, see what the story is really telling you. Design a solution that actually then, based on that data, based on the buy-in from your team members, actually can solve the problem. And don't be afraid to not marry it. Be okay with dating, be okay with testing that problem out, that solution out, excuse me, for a couple of months to see, hey, did this work? Try iterating on a small group. You don't have to overhaul everything all at one time. That's very overwhelming for implementation specialists, for people who have to get used to a new system. That's a lot to have to do. You don't have to bite the whole thing off, but take one is the key problem, the one that will create the biggest impact for you in whatever it is that you're trying to address, and back yourself out of it. And then say, you know what, this one thing will make a big difference, and I think it's important that we tackle it and proceed with that one.
It's hard to say it better than that, but within the discrete process, the one thing that I would want to add in also is like getting those competencies right, even if it's hard to do. And, you know, I think I've already talked a little bit about the specificity we've gotten to beyond our mental model of entrepreneur. And I think that's one thing that Victoria and her team have done a lot at Ideas 42, getting beyond senior associate. Like, if what you're looking for feels vague, get specific about what actually comprises that vagueness. And I think it's easier to be transparent along specific lines than it is with sort of a jumble of expectations, which we so often have.
Thank you, Harrison. So we have just about a minute and a half left. I'm going to wrap things up. Katie, Victoria, and Harrison, I want to thank you for all of the preparatory work that you did for this webinar. I want to thank you for being patient with me and educating me over the last year, you know, helping all of us kind of think about things differently. And I just wanted to, there were a couple things that were said today that really stuck with me. Victoria, you've got a way with words. One of them was, help is only helpful if the receiver thinks it's so. I think we can say that to ourselves probably, you know, every single day as we're working on different things is, you know, is the help that we're trying to provide actually helpful? And do we have what we need to answer that question? Or do we need to kind of ask for help? You know, another thing that you brought up that I really wanted to emphasize again is this whole idea of the value of having a diverse workforce yourself, and, you know, challenging one another and having a culture that's transparent and also where it's expected to challenge one another. So Victoria, you said, you know, the first thing that you can do is look in the mirror. So the first thing you do is look in the mirror, and the next thing you do is ask for people to give you feedback, right? So to ask others, to, you know, engage others that you're working with in your process, whatever you're working towards. So again, I think our contact information is available. If anyone has any questions after this webinar, please feel free to reach out to any one of us. And I thank you for your time and hope that you have a great day. Thank you.